And yes, okay, so yes, Michèle, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thanks so much. Well, I wanted to start by thanking the Red Wheelbarrow for hosting me tonight. Jacques, Ed, and the whole team. I think that you offer a platform for South African poets that's very unique. And it's something that's really valued in this time. You've shown such tenacity to continue having your poetry meetings, even through COVID. It's been like over a year and a half of these Zoom meetings. And I was so delighted to see earlier this year that you're starting to do in-person readings at the bookshop in Takai again. So look out for those, because that bookshop, if you haven't been there, it's a delightful place to go and read and listen to poetry. And I saw Fanula's Darling is reading on Monday for World Poetry Day. So I'm certainly going to try and be there for that. So thank you guys for your commitment to keeping poetry in South Africa going and providing a platform for all of us. So I've got two streams of work that I'm busy with and working from. And I thought I'll just read a little bit from each section of work. So the first is, I don't know how many of you experienced through COVID this complete sort of writer's block. I know you're supposed to have been creative and inspired because you're at home, but it never happened for me. I had a complete writer's block. So for 18 months, I sort of took comfort from what Louise Gluck wrote in American Originality, where she said she had like 4 years of a blank mind in between her collections. She had long periods of writer's block. And to manage this, I did Fanula Darling's poetry course of 6 ways, and it's a fantastic, phenomenal, creative, and inspiring course. And I think that, you know, often as South Africans, we underestimate what we have in South Africa, our own poets, our own writing, and our own teachers. So recently I did a masterclass by Glyn Maxwell. It was offered by Live Canon, and I spent my whole Saturday afternoon, 4 hours or longer, with Glyn Maxwell. And well, all I can say is it was underwhelming. And Fanula's course, the content, what she taught, her creativity and her inspiration, we're like so lucky to have people like that, and the availability and access to people like that teaching poetry. So all the poems that I'm going to read in the first section are poems that arose from my course with Fanula. And I'm very excited about a lot of them. I know that I did read it off the wall recently, so if you have heard some of these, sorry for the duplication, but I've tried to include some that weren't included there as well. I'm going to start with a relatively long poem, While You're All Still Fresh. And this poem was in response to a question that was set about including nostalgia and how to incorporate nostalgia in your poetry. And it follows the format of Dennis Herson's King Kong book, which was published in 2004. And it's a series of brief statements. I remember, I remember, I remember. And he wrote a whole book. I've written 3 pages. And it's those really common things which form the texture of a lived experience, those ordinary, common, everyday things that when read together create a textured, nuanced sort of idea about a period in history. So this is La Infraordinaire. You've remembered my life for me. I remember on the West Rand, pink proteas growing wild and in bloom on the kopje outside our house. I remember the filtered sunlight in the sunroom, the morning mother carefully ironed the white crepe of my first Holy Communion dress. I remember my fingers dripping water as I rolled raw rice and lamb mince into veined grape leaves, the shapes of my hands. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, watching mother scoop out pips and pulp from the inside of marrows to make kusa. I remember when Joanna told me she could not sit on the park bench because she was black, not brown. I remember every Saturday my father marking the newspaper with a pencil to prepare his bets for the races that afternoon. I remember the noise when the police raided the staff quarters in our road to check that Joanna and people like Joanna had their passbooks. I remember the mix of salt and flour on my fingers as I turned soft dough around little balls of meat to make caps for shish barak. I remember dropping trays of caps one by one into a swirling pot of simmering mint-scented yogurt mixed with garlic and butter, and my mother's exclamation, "Sachtain," when I dished up my second helping. I remember when Joanna knelt on the carpet looking in my eyes and told me she had to leave to go home. I remember my parents and our Anglesi neighbors, the Murrays, talking and talking about the bright light of the unidentified flying object that hovered in the sky at dusk for over an hour above our house. I remember listening quietly to my father and uncles whispering of how some years ago, in the 1960s, the Lebanese couldn't own property in Johannesburg because they were not classified as white. I remember sitting cross-legged in front of the telefunken watching Neil Armstrong step onto the moon, and my father saying how the Russians must be going crazy. I remember telling my parents that the most popular girl in grade 1 was given 2 rand for the tuck shop, not 20 cents. I remember the brown square cardboard suitcase with gold-colored latches that my Sutu and Judu proudly bought me before I started grade 1. I remember my brother, sister, and I traveling around Johannesburg, sitting in the boot of my mother's bright yellow Volkswagen Beetle. I remember hearing that my mother was 15 when she met my father and 19 when they married. I remember the ash floating in the night air as the flames of the fire that scoured the koppie reached right up to our patch of back lawn. I remember using a hosepipe to soak and arc the shape of a sickle moon around the perimeter of the lawn to protect us from the flames. I remember my father sitting around a smoky dining room table with his Sunday night card school playing klabias. I remember mother and I serving them platters of cheese and tomato sandwiches, whiskey, and clearing away ashtrays piled with cigarette butts. I remember large family lunches with uncles, aunts, cousins, and the parish priest, children running amok all over the house, and endless bowls of meze. I remember learning that the first time my mother had to loan money from her father to pay my own father's gambling debts was 3 months after they married. I remember when my mother told me Sutu and Juru couldn't visit anymore, ever, because there was a car accident. I remember that my mother, unable to sleep, was reading Thanatopsis in the middle of the night when she received the call about that accident. So the next poem I'm going to read is a eulogy that I wrote for the poet Chris Mann. I published Chris's poetry collection in June or July last year, and we finished it sort of 3 months before he passed. And at the McGregor Poetry Festival, I had a launch for Chris's book, Palimpsest, and no one came. So Brian Walter and Simon van Skalkwyk and I, and Jim Phelps, who was staying at the McGregor Backpackers Lodge, sat under the gazebo and we reminisced and spoke about poetry. And Jacques and Ed arrived to come to the launch. And so they joined us under the gazebo and we had the most amazing launch probably I've ever been to. It was such a special, special time that we spent together, even though it was sort of 40 minutes. And we each spoke about Chris Everyone gave an anecdotal story about him, time that they had spent with him, a special event or something that he had said. We read poems, and I read this poem for Chris, which I wrote for him. And it's called Sending Rain, in memory of Chris Mann. It hadn't rained for months in Makanda, only parched earth, the ache of scorched sand, dust, broken bones, and impossible dryness, where water was collected in buckets from the local spring, salvaged from the back of trucks, or sludge-filled and rendered useless. While you lay there dying, there were daily water cuts, sometimes a week at a time. Yet on the morning you passed, as dawn broke, and for days after your funeral, mist coated the earth, rain soaked the sandy soil, droplets divined in the V's of branches, like alms offered by gifts of the givers, life-giving boreholes, irrigation, seeds. So the next few poems that I'm going to read are poems that relate to COVID. And they were poems that I wrote following my brother's illness. He suffered from COVID in June last year, and he was on a ventilator for 40 days, and he survived that, which was remarkable for all of us. But arising out of this are a series of poems that I wrote while I did the 6 Ways course. And I thought I'd share them with you. I'm going to try not to break in between the poems. I'll read them as a sequence, and I hope you enjoy these. On being gifted a life. In a dream, a dervish hands me my eyes, not the entire eye, only the eyelids. My hair turns kohl, grows lush, falls to my waist. A hijab swirls loosely, less a bloodied red, more amber-tinged, as if the sun reached out, startled, to dilute its darkened depths. The scarf undulates in waves, pendulums of silk pulsing in the breeze, just above the ochre earth, right to the horizon. The dervish covers the whites of my eyes with the skin of my eyelids. I must sew them together to see in a new light. Each day brings a new desolation. That winter, Johannesburg in July, the weather was relentlessly divine. Each morning, the curtains yielded to pale blue skies and a diminished sun, as if winter had whitewashed Earth's palette to neutralize touch. In the afternoons, aloes flowered in defiance, with bright orange spears and yellow candelabra. Alongside William Nicol Drive, acacia trees spread their canopy across the highway, offering unapologetic respite. That winter of COVID, we drove daily for 5 weeks, the route to the hospital that housed my brother. His breath smothered, body contorted, there masked and sanitized, we acquiesced to an array of brutalities made in the name of saving a life. Tracheotomy, intubation, ventilation. On the drive home, silent, mother and I held hands. So this next poem is in 3 parts. Catalogue of the COVID doctor. 1. Things the COVID doctor said. He said things were not looking good. He said we must ask the other doctor to transfer our case to him. He said COVID is unpredictable. He said we could not visit. He said he would report twice daily. He said reporting is at 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. He said he meant any time between 7 to 9 a.m. or between 4 to 8 p.m. He said call the nurses' station if he does not call. He said the nurses have cell phones. He said every patient has extended family. He said he has patients all over the hospital. He said use a WhatsApp group to update the family. He said we could not visit. He said he would let us into the COVID ICU if things got really bad. He said unequivocally, Do not go around asking other doctors for advice. He said we could find another doctor if we expected more. He said we must agree to a tracheotomy. He told us where to sign. He said we must agree to a ventilator. He told us where to sign. He said he can't say. Eventually, he murmured, go into the COVID ICU. 2. Things the COVID doctor felt. The COVID doctor felt that the oxygen levels were still poor. The COVID doctor felt we need not bother with a pulmonologist. The COVID doctor felt antibiotics would clear the new infection. The COVID doctor felt a psychiatrist was unnecessary. The COVID doctor felt a scope was necessary. The COVID doctor felt it was time for the rehabilitation team. The COVID doctor felt it was too early to say. 3. Things the COVID doctor did. The COVID doctor did thank us for the card and the poem, I'm Going to Start Living Like a Mystic by Edward Hirsch. The COVID doctor did work for 3 weekends consecutively. The COVID doctor did occasionally, on the weekends, wear jeans and trainers. In response to the rhetorical question, so you do have a life, the COVID doctor said yes, actually, he did have a life outside the hospital and a family too. So this poem is Anoint the Body. Anoint the body with oil and water, we were told. Make the sign of the cross. Light a candle. But the priest said he no longer anoints the sick in hospital, COVID and all that. Just too risky. We rolled our eyes, even the priest. So every other day in the ICU, I anoint your body with holy oil and water. I, sinner, poor in temperament, anoint your forehead with oils. Turn your palms to face me. Make the sign of the cross along the vein of your lifeline. Pray for mercy. I even anoint the machines, the ventilator, the catheter, the pipes, tape, and tubes. I sprinkle them all with holy water, murmur blessings, recite prayers. Always, always I anoint your sheets, your metal bed, the foam mattress, the place where you lie. I sprinkle water, pretend I am a sage, rub oil into your temples, and before I leave, wet your hair with water curated by others holier than I could ever be. Finally, I seal the oil and water, blow out the candle. Only a miracle can save you now. Do not stride out to that vast lake. During the horror of your hospital sojourn, a vast lake appeared for days. Flat, dark, sullen and still it hovered, its contents murky. Parasitic fish, grim sea urchins, and in the brackish water, all kinds of dangers lurking. Electric eels, fish with teeth on tongue, piranhas, vampire fish, and giant devil catfish that leave no remains behind. Yet somehow you heard our urging. Remember the warmth of your child's hand. Remember a cheek on your cheek. Remember the honey conjured by bees. And our cries, no matter what is inflicted upon you, do not stride out to that vast lake. So I didn't know this, but Walt Whitman had a terrible stroke when he was in his 50s. And he wrote he had a phenomenal book published called Specimen Days, and it's extracts of his diary entries, particularly after the 2-year period, after he was bedridden, on his recovery and how he recovered. And he writes that it was predominantly through his communion with nature. He had a farm out in the country where he used to go, and he spent long periods of time outside in nature. So this is recovery. In Specimen Days, Walt Whitman writes of the stroke that rendered him bedridden for years, how in his then half-paralytic body, he regained a life force. The first frost, spring overtures, a sunbath, the full starred nights, my native sand and salt. Page after page, he writes of midnight migrations of immense flocks of birds, swarms of wild bees in their thousands, swelling like a moving cloud, he resting under the wild cherry enveloped in their drone. Of trees, water, grass, and sunlight, the moon and the stars. He renders detailed lists of the names of trees, bird life, the stars, and even the wildflowers, a deep awareness of the nuance of sunlight in every form, the beauty of evening shadows. In The Lesson of a Tree, he weighs up the existence of dryads and extols the power of trees. Sometimes he wakes at midnight just to watch Venus rise in the blue-black sky and inhale the acoustic air. Frequently, he communes with the invisible physician, a vital presence found in solitary places that imparts a silent medicine to the physical body. Whenever he is able, he hobbles to water, small dams, and nearby ponds to watch his favorite kingfishers, to listen to the sounds of nature, to sing robustly out loud, and if his new body allows him, to swim for long stretches in the icy water. And so I've got one poem left in this sequence, which I'll finish with, and then we'll see how we're doing for time. In my mother's heart. In my mother's heart rests an abundance of honeysuckle with a sweet scent of rosewater and ripe plum. There is an open field of long grass with fragrant lilac wildflowers that rise en masse above the sheaves into warm sunlight. My mother's heart renders rare studies, charcoal drawings in impossible detail of hands folded in a half circle. There, each season evolves in a day, the rising sun alongside the aureole of the moon, the stars and constellation. In my mother's heart, there are spaces and shadows, areas of unexpected light that warm to the marrow. There, the sun casts its rays across a lilting stream, revealing grass rising on the far bank, lush and green. So how are we doing for time? Is it sort of
We're still good.
Another 10 minutes or so?
Yeah, another 10, 15 minutes or so.
10, 15, okay. So my new collection that is coming out in October is called Dark Horse. And there's 3 sections in that collection, and each section is prefaced by a quote from John Berryman from 11 Addresses to the Lord, which is his outstanding poem. I can recommend it to anyone. I love reading that poem over and over. So section 3 of that collection, I'm going to read a few poems from section 3, not from the first 2 sections. And this is the quote from John Berryman that prefaces that section. And it's something that I actually have in my diary and read over and over to myself. Oil all my turbulence, as at thy dictation I sweat out my wayward works. Father Hopkins said, the only true literary critic is Christ. Let me lie down exhausted, content with that. Jacques asked me to read Premonition, which was the poem in the advert that the Red Wheelbarrow sent out. And so Jacques, I'm reading this especially for you. Thank you, Jacques, for hosting me tonight. Premonition. Last night, a creature crossed my path, its muscles line taut, skin gray and rhino thick beneath, teeth bared in dimmest light. It did not look me in the eye, but flicked its head annoyed, loitered ahead to skulk before a drawbridge in the void. So this third section has a sort of mix of poems in it. There are several travel poems, poems about different areas, many poems to different poets and that speak to poems written by different poets, and some intertextual poems, found poems as well. So I'll read one of each of those samples just to give you a feeling for the collection. This is Butandan, Mozambique, 2018, and Butandan is the Philippine word for whale shark. In Tofino Bay, I swim with a whale shark, gigantic creature previously birthed in my consciousness thanks to National Geographic, now an arm's length from my outreached palm. Its wide flat head and two small eyes watch me curiously. Brown and cream speckled, its luminous weight weighs on me. I lick salt and kelp rind from my lips. My goggles fog. A cool humming radiates from my ear canals into clumsy limbs. Buddhists say and I'm a seahorse, tethered to seagrass on the ocean floor, and hastily flutter my fin, backing away to halt the striking vision of a life. So one of my favorite poems is The Peninsula by Seamus Heaney. And I wrote a poem after reading that poem for many, many times. And I thought that I'd begin by reading you The Peninsula by Seamus Heaney. And after that, I will read Uncoding Landscape, which is my poem that I wrote subsequent to that. So please enjoy this. This is The Peninsula by Seamus Heaney. When you have nothing more to say, just drive for a day all around the peninsula. This is alive, though always skirting landfall. At dusk, horizons drink down sea and hill. The ploughed field swallows the whitewashed gable, and you're in the dark again. Now recall the glazed foreshore and silhouetted log, that rock where breakers shredded into rags, the leggy birds stilted on their own legs, islands riding themselves out into the fog. And drive back home, still with nothing to say, except that now you will uncode all landscapes by this, things founded clean on their own shapes, water and ground in their extremity. Uncoding Landscape, after Seamus Heaney's The Peninsula. Heaney writes, when you have nothing more to say, go drive around the peninsula. And shock-stilled I do, searching the contours for his rocks and logs, fields, leggy birds, and islands rising out of the fog to the bay. But all I can see is the road before me, a long haul past twisted chicken wire fencing and gates, lopsided and leading me through Chapman's Peak, alongside cliffs and ravines, where workers in brazen orange overalls brace canopies onto rocky hillsides, an omen of falling debris. I search the cirrus skies. Uncode, Heaney counsels, and my eyes settle below on the dense moon-flat ocean, where across False Bay's expanse in my far sight, I spot a speck, a miniature white lighthouse, mature in its aged loneliness, standing mute, offering in a lure, solace to ships on furious, storm-ridden nights. And then I'm going to end with a poem that I wrote for the AVBOB poetry project. I must thank Douglas Skinner. He is such a supporter of my work. It often appears in stanzas, and this poem was a commission for the AVBOB poetry project, encouraged by Douglas. So thank you, Douglas. This is Zoetrope. For how many years will my blood run cold as your name and deed are whispered in the chill? When will your memory in my body unfold? In restaurants, my future's been foretold by sages or savants bearing goodwill. Yet, whenever it's said, my blood runs cold. Running on forest pathways, I must grab hold of bark or risk my footing to that familiar ill. When will your memory in my body unfold? Even the wicked are eventually paroled. Stride out or broken, limp on up the hill. For how many years will my blood run cold? Will months or years, centuries or eons enfold the cataracts in my eyes, excise and distill your memory from my body? Or will they unfold it finally, so I at last can cross the threshold, don a white cassock, the cross and mitre with will? For how many years will my blood run cold? When will your memory in my body unfold?
Thank you so much, Michèle. Can we all unmute ourselves and give Michèle a round of applause? Thank you so much, Michèle. That was beautiful. I connected with so much of that, especially that first section, because of some of the poetry that you read. But before I ask my questions, Margaret's hand has been up, but I'll stop the recording and then we can have a conversation.
Okay.